The clock showed 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson pulled into the parking lot outside Greenville's Municipal Courthouse in South Carolina. The morning sun was already warm, casting long shadows across the pavement. Kendrick let out a long breath. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his life was built around order and preparation. But today, things hadn't gone as planned. This morning wasn't supposed to be stressful. He was simply there to fix a mistake in a property tax bill for the house his grandmother had left him. The city had unexpectedly raised the taxes, and Kendrick had spent weeks collecting proof that it was a mistake. That house meant more than money. It was the heart of his childhood, where he learned right from wrong under his grandmother's care. Wearing a dark navy suit and crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked every bit the experienced lawyer he was. Even if his morning had been rough, a last-minute phone call about an active human trafficking case had slowed him down. The defense team had filed an urgent motion, and Kendrick had to respond before heading to court. He reviewed the motion, gave his input, then rushed out the door, barely on time. As he climbed the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A message popped up from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. The judge in Greenville doesn't go easy on late arrivals. Be careful. Kendrick sighed and slipped his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't too worried. He had the facts on his side. Still, the warning stuck in his mind. Inside, the courthouse felt different from the federal courts Kendrick was used to. The walls were a dull beige, the benches worn from years of use, and the air carried the scent of coffee and old paper. It wasn't fancy, but it was busy. People moved in and out, carrying folders and documents, their faces showing the stress of parking tickets and small claims. Kendrick glanced at his watch. 8:50 a.m. Just 10 minutes to find the right courtroom. He followed the hallway signs, passing people whispering quietly. Outside room 204, a brass plaque read, Judge Charles Whitman. Kendrick adjusted his tie and stepped in. The room was already filling up. He found a seat in the back and opened his folder to go over his paperwork one last time. As he reviewed his notes, the judge entered. Judge Charles Whitman, tall, silver-haired, with sharp blue eyes, didn't need to say anything to get everyone's attention. His stern reputation showed in the way he scanned the room, missing nothing. All rise, the bailiff called. Everyone stood. Kendrick straightened his back and joined them. The judge took his seat and silence fell. One by one, Judge Whitman began calling cases. His tone was cold and to the point. Kendrick watched closely. A middle-aged man in a suit arrived late, but slipped in without trouble. A young woman in casual clothes entered quietly and sat down. The judge didn't say a word to either of them. Kendrick noticed, but stayed focused on his own task. At 9:15 a.m., Kendrick finally heard his name. He gathered his things and walked to the front, calm despite the earlier delay. As he reached the podium, Judge Whitman looked up. His face changed, his expression hardened. Kendrick felt a sudden shift in the room. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge snapped, his voice slicing through the silence. "Do you think your time is more important than the court's?" Kendrick raised a hand slightly, palms open, trying to explain. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was handling an urgent matter at the federal level." "Excuses don't excuse lateness," the judge interrupted. "This court runs on discipline and respect. If you can't follow that, maybe you need to rethink your priorities." Kendrick felt dozens of eyes on him. He stayed calm and picked his words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand how important punctuality is. May I present my case about the property tax mistake?" The judge waved a hand. "We'll get to that. First, let's address your contempt. Being late disrespects this court. You are fined $750. The words hit like a hammer. Kendrick's jaw tightened, but his face stayed neutral. Quiet whispers spread through the room. "Your Honor," Kendrick said steadily, "may I explain?" "You may not," the judge said firmly, raising his gavel. "Take this as a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick stepped back, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just about being late. It felt like something deeper. He glanced at the others who had arrived late. None of them had been called out. The difference was clear. Kendrick wasn't going to ignore it. Back at his seat, he opened his folder, not to review the tax documents, but to take notes. His pen moved quickly. Meanwhile, Judge Whitman continued, his voice steady and cold. Kendrick knew one thing for sure. This was no normal morning. He sat in the back row, thoughts swirling. The courtroom kept moving, but Kendrick couldn't shake what had just happened. He replayed it over and over. The harsh fine, the way others were ignored for the same thing. The young woman who had arrived before him now sat near the front, casually scrolling through her phone. No warning, no fine. A man in a gray blazer, currently speaking to the judge, had clearly come in late too. Still, no penalty. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was a pattern. And Kendrick could see it just as clearly as the papers in his hands. A $750 fine for being late in municipal court? That was far too much. Punishment meant to send a message. He glanced around. Some people looked shocked. Others seemed uncomfortable. A few looked curious. He could tell they had all noticed the same thing, but no one said a word. Next case, Judge Whitman announced. Kendrick's name echoed once more. He stood calm and steady and returned to the podium. The judge stared him down again, eyes sharp, as if daring Kendrick to make a mistake. Your Honor, Kendrick began, his voice level, I have documentation showing the property tax adjustment is incorrect. This home has been in my family for generations, and the numbers don't match what the city assessed. Kendrick placed his folder on the podium and opened it, showing neatly arranged documents and photos. He pointed to a specific page. This page shows the original tax assessment. It stayed the same for 5 years, he explained, but the new bill shows a 30% increase. There was no warning or explanation. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, looking uninterested. I'll look at it when I get to it, Mr. Robinson. But your lateness this morning is a serious matter. He paused before asking coldly, do you really believe your federal duties make it okay to disrespect this court? Kendrick stayed calm. Your Honor, I didn't mean any disrespect. I was delayed by a federal case, one involving human trafficking. I'm sure we can all agree that such a matter demands urgent attention. The judge narrowed his eyes, though his voice remained firm. Even important work doesn't give you permission to ignore court rules. These rules exist for a reason. It wasn't just what the judge said, it was how he said it. Kendrick felt the dismissal in his tone. The message was clear. His explanation didn't matter. His career, his values, even his respect for the system. None of it seemed to count in that moment. He took a slow, steady breath. Your Honor, I understand rules are important, Kendrick said carefully. But I need to ask, are these rules applied to everyone the same way in this courtroom? A wave of tension moved through the room. The judge's body stiffened, his face flushing red. Are you questioning this court's fairness, Mr. Robinson? I'm asking for clarity, Kendrick replied, keeping his voice level. It matters that everyone here is treated fairly, not just me. The judge slammed the gavel down sharply. I won't allow accusations against this court. Your fine stands. Kendrick nodded slightly, keeping his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He walked back to his seat, feeling every eye on him. Some people looked impressed. Others seemed nervous. Kendrick had faced unfair treatment before, but this moment felt different. The room was holding its breath, waiting to see what he'd do next. He quietly took out his phone and started typing notes. He wasn't finished, not even close. Right then, he made a decision. This wasn't going to end here. The court session carried on, but Kendrick's presence had already shifted the mood. People noticed. An older black man a few rows ahead turned and gave Kendrick a short, knowing look. The court clerk, typing rapidly, started hesitating more often, her discomfort showing. When the hearing ended, Kendrick waited as others left. He watched the way they moved, some carrying the weight of what had just happened. A young woman in the back corner, clearly a law student, was writing furiously in her notebook. Her face was full of focus and admiration. Kendrick finally stepped outside, his briefcase in hand. The crisp air did little to shake the feeling in his chest. The courthouse buzzed with normal activity, but his mind was locked on what had unfolded. He paused on the steps, staring at his phone, thumb resting on the contact for his assistant back at the U.S. Attorney's office. "No," he said under his breath. "Not yet." He stepped aside and opened his notes again. What he had seen and experienced in that courtroom wasn't random. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It was part of something bigger. The unfairness he'd witnessed wasn't accidental. It was built into the system. His legal instincts kicked in. This was more than a tax issue or a fine. Kendrick saw the start of a much bigger case forming, one that needed to be pursued. Back in his car, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out his badge and credentials. The golden seal of the Department of Justice glinted in the sunlight, coming through the windshield. He made his decision. When he returned to the courtroom, most of the morning cases were over. The room was quieter, with only a few people left, flipping through papers or waiting. Judge Whitman sat reviewing documents. He looked calm, but also tired. Kendrick walked confidently to the front, holding his badge and ID. The court clerk looked up, her fingers stopping mid-typing. Judge Whitman glanced up too, and annoyance crossed his face. "Mr. Robinson, the court session is over," the judge said sharply. "If you need something, schedule an appointment." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Kendrick replied, his voice steady, "I think it's important I properly introduce myself." He raised his badge so everyone could see it. "I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've worked for the Justice Department for over 10 years, focusing on human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hand stopping over papers. His face lost color as Kendrick spoke. Around the room, the few remaining people watched closely, curiosity in their eyes. "I was late this morning because of a federal case that required my attention," Kendrick continued, respectful but firm. "And while I respect this court's rules, I couldn't ignore how differently cases were handled today." The judge's mouth tightened. "Mr. Robinson, if you believe there was a problem, you're free to file a formal complaint." "I've already started documenting everything," Kendrick said, holding up his notebook. "Not just what happened to me, but the way other late arrivals were treated, especially how the responses differed based on race. As a federal prosecutor, I'm required to report any signs of discrimination or bias I see in court." Judge Whitman leaned back slowly, clearly uncomfortable. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Robinson?" "I'm simply reporting what I saw," Kendrick answered calmly. "My job is to make sure justice is equal for everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. What I saw today raises serious questions." The room was silent. You could hear a pin drop. The court clerk looked nervously between Kendrick and the judge. Her hands hovered above the keyboard. The law student in the corner was still scribbling, her eyes wide with interest. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This court takes such concern seriously. If you believe there's been a mistake in judgment, follow the proper procedures." Kendrick placed his badge and ID on the podium. "I plan to, Your Honor," he said, "but I also think this is a moment to reflect on how we make sure fairness and equality are truly upheld in every courtroom." Judge Whitman shifted uneasily in his chair, his hands tightening on the armrests. He had led this courtroom for decades, and rarely had anyone challenged his authority so directly. For the first time, he seemed unsure. "You may go, Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice quieter than before. Kendrick picked up his badge and turned to leave, but before stepping away, he added, "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll make sure this is handled through the right channels." As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom again, he could feel the eyes of everyone still inside watching him. The moment was heavy. This wasn't just about defending himself. It was about standing up to a system that often overlooked its own unfairness. Outside, Kendrick pulled out his phone and started typing a detailed email to his office. He included every observation, every interaction, and each unfair moment he had witnessed. When he finally hit send, he knew it was just the beginning. The email spread faster than Kendrick expected. By the next morning, his phone rang. It was a call from the U.S. Attorney's office. His supervisor, Julia Harper, a sharp and experienced attorney, sounded both concerned and curious. "I read your report," she said. "If what you described is true, It's not just an isolated incident. It could show a deeper problem. I believe it does, Kendrick answered. What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's seen it. Julia let out a slow breath. I'll contact the Judicial Review Commission. We'll need to proceed carefully, but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much evidence as possible. If this becomes public, we need to be prepared. After the call, Kendrick got to work. He spent hours piecing together every detail from the court session. He searched public records, looking for inconsistencies in Judge Whitman's rulings. A pattern began to emerge. Black defendants were fined far more often and more heavily for the same offenses. White defendants, in many cases, were let off with warnings or smaller penalties. Kendrick reached out to local attorneys and community members who had appeared before Judge Whitman. The response was overwhelming. Stories came pouring in. Some shared quietly, others boldly. A young black woman said she was fined a large amount for a parking ticket, while a white man with multiple violations paid only a small fee. Another person described how the judge often interrupted black defendants, barely giving them a chance to explain. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission launched a formal investigation. Investigators came to the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, proved to be key. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk. "These are my notes," she whispered. "Every time something felt wrong, I wrote it down. I've been too scared to speak, until now." The notebook revealed clear patterns, dates, names, and cases where people were treated unfairly. Investigators also spoke with James Wilson, the longtime bailiff. "I've worked here 15 years, he said softly. "I've seen the judge treat people differently based on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think I could change anything." Meanwhile, word of the courtroom exchange began to spread. The law student who had been there posted a detailed story on social media. Within hours, it went viral, sparking outrage and a flood of similar accounts. Soon, headlines began to appear. Bias in Greenville courtroom. Federal prosecutor speaks out. News stations picked up the story. Kendrick found himself in the middle of a growing controversy. Reporters called constantly, but he stayed focused on the case. The pressure quickly mounted on Judge Whitman. Rumors spread about closed-door meetings with oversight boards. Though he denied wrongdoing in public, behind closed doors, he began to understand the seriousness of the situation. At the end of the first week, Kendrick received another call from Julia. "The data is overwhelming," she said. "We've reviewed the records. Black defendants were fined nearly 3 times more often than white defendants for the same offenses. It's not just a mistake, it's a system." "What's the next step?" Kendrick asked. "We're bringing it to the state judicial board," Julia said. "And Kendrick, the media won't let this go. Be ready." He nodded, feeling tired but steady. This was bigger than he had expected, but he wasn't backing down. By the second week, the story had reached far beyond Greenville. National news outlets picked it up. Headlines read, "Systemic bias exposed. Federal prosecutor fights back." Social media buzzed with hashtags like #EqualJusticeNo and #BiasIntoCourts, with thousands sharing their own experiences of discrimination in courtrooms. Through it all, Kendrick stayed focused. He worked with the Judicial Review Commission to organize the evidence. The findings were devastating. Over 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants 300% more on average than white defendants for the same violations. Late arrivals by white defendants were often ignored. Black defendants, in contrast, faced fines or public scolding. Even requests for payment plans or extensions were more often denied to black defendants. But the numbers were only part of the story. People came forward, some publicly, others in private, to tell what had happened to them. A black mother spoke of being fined $500 for disputing a zoning issue, even though she had solid proof the city was wrong. A young black man said the judge mocked him in court, questioning his work ethic. Then, minutes later, excused a white defendant in a similar case without comment. Activists and local groups joined in. Rallies were held outside the courthouse. Protesters carried signs that read, "Justice should be blind," and "Bias now." Kendrick kept out of the spotlight as much as he could, but he couldn't ignore what was unfolding inside the courthouse. The pressure continued to grow. Staff who had worked under Judge Whitman for years began speaking out. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, became a key figure. Her notes, combined with official records, revealed a long history of unfair treatment. "I never thought anyone would care," she told investigators. "But now that the truth is coming out, I can't stay quiet anymore." Even James Wilson, the longtime bailiff, made a public statement. "I've seen this behavior for years," he said. "It's wrong, and it's time something was done." Judge Whitman found himself increasingly alone. At first, he brushed off the accusations, calling them misunderstandings. But as the evidence piled up, he had no choice but to respond. In a rare public statement, he said he regretted any unintentional harm, but his words felt empty compared to what people had seen and heard. Despite the attention, Kendrick stayed focused. He kept working as a federal prosecutor, knowing his job didn't end with this case. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing number of messages arriving at his office. Letters, calls, and emails came from across the country, some offering support, others sharing similar stories from other courtrooms. One letter, from a retired lawyer in Alabama, struck a chord. "For years I saw the same injustice, but I stayed silent. Thank you for speaking up when so many of us didn't." The movement soon spread beyond Greenville. Other judges in South Carolina came under review as journalists, and activists examined court records. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee launched a wider investigation into local courts, promising to address long-standing bias. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission released its first report. The findings were clear and disturbing. Judge Whitman's behavior was not a one-time issue. It was part of a deeper, widespread problem. The report called for urgent changes, required bias training for all judges, regular reviews of court decisions, and new independent oversight boards. Under mounting pressure and facing the threat of a public disciplinary hearing, Judge Whitman resigned. In a short statement, he said, "I believe stepping aside is in the best interest of this court and this community." The public had mixed reactions. Some saw it as an admission to guilt, others as a necessary step toward healing. For Kendrick, it wasn't a moment to celebrate. It was a step forward. But the real work was just beginning. As reforms rolled out, Kendrick was invited to speak at law schools, public forums, and legal conferences. His story inspired young lawyers, especially those from underrepresented communities, to believe they could make a difference. At one event, a young black law student came up to him afterward. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules. It's about people," she said. "Now I want to fight for justice, too." Kendrick smiled, humbled. "The fight's just starting," he said. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after that courtroom morning, the courthouse in Greenville looked different. The walls had been painted, and a new help desk welcomed visitors. Signs in different languages pointed people toward resources like legal aid and payment plans. Near the entrance, a simple plaque read, "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside, the changes were even more meaningful. Judge Whitman was gone. In his place was a younger judge known for fairness and respect. Systemic reforms were underway. Every staff member had to take training led by experts on how bias can affect decision-making in subtle ways. Kendrick stood quietly in the back of the newly improved courtroom, preparing to speak to a group of judges and lawyers. As he looked around, he felt a mix of pride and cautious hope. Change had begun, but the journey wasn't over. The impact reached far beyond Greenville. Inspired by Kendrick, other towns and cities started reviewing their own court systems. Judicial boards across the country introduced new audits and data checks to track racial and economic differences in court rulings. Oversight committees were formed, made up of lawyers, community leaders, and former defendants, to monitor fairness in real time. At Kendrick's office, the energy was different. On one wall hung the fine he had received that morning. Not as a prize, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Beneath it was a photo of a group of law students who had started a civil rights clinic named in his honor. Their smiling faces reminded him of what this work was really about: the next generation. In the community, change was visible. James Wilson, the former bailiff, now led training sessions for new court officers. Our job isn't just to keep order, he told one group. It's to make sure every person is treated with respect. And if you see something wrong, say something. Staying silent only makes it worse. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk whose notes had played a major role in the investigation, had been promoted. She now led a program focused on courtroom ethics and trained new clerks, determined to prevent the mistakes of the past. Kendrick's influence extended beyond the courtroom. He began teaching a class at a nearby law school on ethics and civil rights. His students often stayed after class, eager to learn more. One day, a student approached her with a notebook full of ideas. "What's the most important thing we can do to make the justice system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick paused before answering. "Listen," he said. "Listen to the people who come through our courts, and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Change starts with listening." Of course, not everyone welcomed the reforms. Some judges and lawyers pushed back, saying the new rules hurt their authority. But the numbers didn't lie. Within a year, racial disparities in court outcomes in Greenville dropped sharply. More people were approved for payment plans. Defendants said they felt heard and respected. For Kendrick, the most meaningful moments came when people shared their gratitude. One day, an elderly black man approached him outside the courthouse. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice shaking. "I've seen so much unfairness. But I never thought I'd live to see someone finally say enough. Thank you for giving us hope." Another morning, Kendrick received a letter from a young public defender in Chicago. She had read about his story and started investigating her own local court. She ended the letter with, "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer." Kendrick read the letter twice, then placed it into a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the moment settle in. It had never been about him. It was always about the voices that had been ignored for too long. Months later, Kendrick returned to the Greenville courthouse, not for a case, but to speak at the opening of a new Center for Judicial Ethics, created partly because of his efforts. He stepped to the podium, looking out at a packed room, judges, lawyers, staff, and members of the community. "Justice isn't just about laws," Kendrick began. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about dignity, fairness, and respect. And making sure that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was loud and long. But Kendrick wasn't thinking about praise. He looked into the crowd and saw something far more important. Hope. Change had begun.